In the Southern Wolf Empire, power is not measured by justice, but balanced on the edge of a blade and the dried rush upon the throne. Here, the strongest is he who possesses no heart, and the noblest is he who knows the most cruelty. Yet, behind the radiant facade of towering marble walls lies a truth no noble dares to whisper. The greatest Alpha King, a man who commands legions and wields an aura capable of shaking the very heavens, is slowly withering away within his own royal cage. He did not fall to the swords of his enemies. He fell to the screaming darkness within his own mind. Madness, the brutal gift of royal rush, is tightening its grip on his sanity, transforming a sovereign ruler into a monster, clawing for salvation in the promise of death. The court views it as a decline. The queen views it as an opportunity, and he views it as his final, ultimate punishment. Until she arrives. She is neither a resplendent noblewoman nor a maiden chosen by sacred rites. She is merely a mute maid, marked by the stigma of her low birth and bound by a cruel curse that has sealed her voice for 10 years. In the eyes of the elite, she is a useless creature, a being unworthy of notice, a nameless shadow within the opulent castle. She is forced to kneel, forced to silence, and forced to endure the indignities that this society inflicts upon the weak. But amidst the suffocating incense of political intrigue and the threatening growls of frenzied wolves, she brings a different scent. The smell of earth damp after rain, of wild, unrefined daisies, a fragrance that does not belong in the castle, yet is the only thing capable of soothing the wolf within him. When the world demands she kneel for her lowly status, the instincts of this brutal Alpha King tremble with the urge to kneel before her soul. A silent alliance, a bond forged in agony between a king losing his reason and a mute girl stripped of her voice. In an empire that worships power, will her stillness be enough to topple a ruthless, patriarchal dynasty, or will it merely stand as a testament to the final sacrifice of a heart that dared to love when the whole world hated? Chapter 1. The sharp, piercing crack of shattered crystal tore through the suffocating perfection of the royal hall. The jarring sound raked against eardrums, followed by a deathly silence that stretched for agonizing seconds before malicious whispers erupted like a disturbed beehive. The air was heavy, cloying with the scent of expensive incense, a suffocating perfume that curled around the smell of red wine spilling across the ice-cold marble floor. Amidst this grotesque display of regality, Layla knelt, hunched over. A heavy sack of potatoes had been overturned, its contents spilling across the floor. Mud-stained tubers rolled aimlessly beneath the jewel-encrusted heels of haughty aristocrats. A young nobleman, the culprit who had tripped her for his own amusement, loomed over her with eyes brimming with utter contempt. He kicked her bag with a gold-embroidered boot, his voice dripping with venom. "Where did you think you were taking this filth, you dirty mute?" Two guards instantly lunged forward, their thick, leather-gloved hands pressing down on Layla's shoulders, forcing her to prostrate herself against a frigid stone. Pain shot through her spine, yet Layla did not utter a sound. She could not. The rush oath cast upon her a decade ago had sealed her vocal cords into a permanent, silent grave. Rush began to bead from Layla's index finger, sliced open by a sharp, unforgiving shard of crystal. Dark crimson droplets pooled onto the pristine, white floor. She did not weep, nor did she lower her head to beg for scraps of pity. Beneath her matted hair and rags of coarse, cheap fabric, Layla's ash-brown eyes remained fixed on the crowd, composed and icy. Her silence was not the submission of the weak. It was the final barrier protecting the boundaries of her soul. None in this stifling, gilded cage had the right to violate the pride she kept buried deep within. She endured this public humiliation only for the sake of her brother, Liam, currently rotting in the cold, watery dungeons. On the dais above, Queen Cassandra offered a faint, chilling smile, her gaze dismissing Layla as nothing more than a lowly insect. Then, the rhythmic strike of steel-clad heels against stone echoed through the hall, signaling the arrival of a true predator. With every stride the man took, the air seemed to drain from the room. The temperature plummeted to freezing. The chatter of the nobility was silenced in their throats. The crushing pressure of an alpha king descended like an avalanche, forcing every aristocrat to instinctively bow their heads in terror. Orion, the alpha prince, stood at the grand entrance. He was draped in a deep black velvet cloak, yet his broad shoulders were unnaturally rigid. Veins pulsed against the back of his hands as he white-knuckled the hilt of his sword. His breathing was ragged and labored. Inside Orion's mind, 1,000 invisible blades were shredding his nerves. Queen Cassandra's toxic incense had taken hold. The wolf within him was howling in a frenzied madness, desperate to tear everything apart to escape the agony. His vision blurred into a crimson haze. Control was slipping through his calloused fingers. He stumbled forward, sending the entire assembly scurrying back in sheer terror. No one dared to draw a breath as they faced the monster unraveling on his own throne. But just as Orion teetered on the brink of collapse, he stopped. His chest heaved as he fought for a ragged breath. Through the suffocating, toxic miasma that choked his lungs, the alpha's heightened senses caught a stray, impossible scent. It was not the stifling perfume of the nobility. It was the scent of damp earth after a summer downpour, intertwined with crushed bark and wild, bruised daisies. It was a feral, rustic, and tranquil fragrance, one that carried an absolute, soothing power over his fractured mind. The madness in Orion's head subsided instantly, the wolf's roar morphing into a primal, submissive longing. His piercing, amber eyes scanned the hall, cutting through the trembling crowd to lock onto the small pool of rush on the marble. His gaze traced the line from her calloused, bleeding fingers up to the resolute face of the mute girl kneeling amidst the scattered potatoes. He began to walk, a slow, deliberate march toward her. Though his pace was measured, no one in the room dared to block the king's path. The guards holding Layla's shoulders scrambled back in horror as the Alpha King closed the distance. On the dais, Queen Cassandra's face drained of color, her hand clawing into the velvet of her golden throne until her knuckles turned white. Orion stopped directly in front of Layla, standing at a perilously close distance. She could feel the radiating heat from his body, hearing the ragged, fractured rhythm of his breathing. The man was a mountain, blotting out the light, casting her in his formidable shadow. Yet, as he leaned down, brushing his lips against the frigid air beside her ear, the gesture held none of the slaughterous intent of an attack. His hot breath ghosted against the sensitive skin of her nape, carrying the scent of pine and the lethal danger of a predator. His massive, rough hand rose, not touching her, yet hovering close enough for his warmth to envelop the bleeding wound on her finger. The man's massive chest rumbled with a low, primal growl, an ethereal sound that only she could hear. "You have no wolf," Orion rasped, his voice ragged from fighting the pain, yet sharp as a razor blade slicing through the darkness. "You are just a lowborn mute." His flaming amber eyes pinned her steady, ash-colored gaze, where not a flicker of fear remained. "But why is it that your filthy scent is the only thing that makes my wolf stop screaming?" Chapter 2. The massive oak doors slammed shut, echoing throughout the long, deserted corridor after Orion ordered the guards to release Layla and dismissed Serena's presence. The space within the Alpha King's chambers was quickly engulfed in a suffocating silence. The cold, distinct scent of pine, characteristic of Orion, still lingered on the thick velvet curtains that blocked out the sunlight. That natural fragrance offered a faint sense of safety to someone who had just escaped the jaws of death, but that brief comfort was quickly and completely shattered. A thick, toxic plume of incense smoke, carrying the gray ashes of death, began to creep through the gaps beneath the grand doors. The opulent yet venom-filled scent instantly overpowered the natural pine, transforming the vast room into a suffocating, inescapable cage. The rough friction of expensive silk sweeping along the marble floor immediately heralded the arrival of the uninvited. Queen Cassandra sauntered into the chambers with her close attendants, carrying bronze censers that endlessly spewed forth poisonous clouds. The sound of her black, jewel-encrusted scepter striking the floor created dry, rhythmic echoes, a sound deeply menacing to any who heard it. The toxic clouds instantly surrounded the mute girl's small frame, weaving into her every shallow breath, making her lungs ache as if pierced by thousands of sharp needles. Layla felt her oxygen supply being ruthlessly throttled. Her chest heaved repeatedly from the lack of air, while her vision began to blur behind the thick screen of smoke. However, the resilient spirit of a hunter, accustomed to life in the wild countryside, would not allow her to easily collapse before those who trampled upon her. Layla struggled to retreat backward, using her calloused hands, marked by labor-wrought scratches, to steady herself against the cold stone wall, keeping her body upright. Layla's steadfast ash-gray eyes locked onto the heavily painted face of the Wicked Queen, without the slightest intention of bowing or showing any sign of panic. Queen Cassandra curled her lip in a thin, cold smile as she witnessed the futile stubbornness of one of such low status. She began to chant dark incantations from deep within her throat, activating a torturous magic upon the body of the potato-carrying maid. An invisible pressure, heavy as 1,000 weights, slammed down upon Layla's thin shoulders. Sharp, excruciating pain raced along each of her cervical vertebrae, reminding her of the horrific rush oath that had sealed her vocal cords with dark magic for 10 long years. Memories of her foster brother, Liam, instantly flooded back. The image of the gentle young man, chained by rusted iron fetters in the dark, watery palace dungeon, rose vividly in her mind. If she were to let out even a tiny sound or attempt to flee this gilded cage, her brother's life would be instantly forfeited to the cold, encroaching water. Layla's chest continued to heave with choked but resolute breaths, fighting the dark power closing in. The acrid, pungent incense smoke grew ever denser, causing cold sweat to break out and dampen the young girl's pale forehead. Cassandra slowly stepped closer, her contemptuous gaze fixed on the rugged, raised scars left by the rush oath on Layla's porcelain-white neck. The queen lowered her voice, whispering into the silent void, yet every word uttered carried lethal venom and the smug arrogance of one who held the power of life and death in her hands. Do not delude yourself into thinking that the madly decaying prince can become a sturdy shield to protect your life. A glimmer of cruelty flashed in the queen's eyes as she used the cold tip of her scepter to lift Layla's resolute chin upward. In this kingdom that worships absolute power, a low-born mute like you has only 2 choices. You can obediently serve as a tool for my agenda, or you will quickly become a fated soul at the bottom of the water dungeon. Chapter 3. The sound of heavy, dragging footsteps echoed along the marble corridor, signaling the return of the kingdom's most powerful man. The massive oak door slowly creaked open, pushed by a hand thick with taut, blue-strained veins. Orion stepped into his chambers, his body drenched in cold sweat, his mind incessantly raked by the fierce onslaught of the toxic incense. He had steeled himself to face a stifling, venomous space, deliberately left behind by his stepmother, Cassandra, to torture his sanity. Yet, the air that greeted the Alpha King did not carry the suffocating, acrid sting of that dark magic. His hypersensitive senses immediately realized that the toxic incense had been minimized to the absolute limit. Instead, the vast expanse of the chamber was enveloped in a wild, rustic scent, the breath of earth damp after rain and the crisp, fresh aroma of wild daisies. That pure vitality seeped into every cell, swiftly soothing his nerves, which were strung as tight as bowstrings, and caressing the wolf that was constantly howling in madness within his chest. Orion's weary, golden eyes slowly scanned the dim room in search of the source of this rare comfort. Right next to the bronze censer, which had gone completely cold, Layla was silently kneeling on the freezing stone floor. The small girl, bearing the status of a potato-carrying maid, was meticulously using a wet cloth to wipe away every trace of the gray ash that the cruel queen had heartlessly left behind. She had received no command to clean up this dangerous substance. Her actions stemmed from deep compassion and the keen survival instincts of one well-versed in dealing with deadly traps. Layla understood all too well that this dust was the very cause of the Alpha King's descent into madness, and she had no desire to see the only person capable of protecting her brother's life destroyed by dark magic. Orion's presence at such close proximity seemed to thicken the air with the overwhelming pressure of a ruler. The heat radiating from the man's muscular body enveloped Layla's slender frame. He did not exert his absolute power to force the mute girl into servitude or demand a formal royal obeisance. Orion simply stood in silence at a distance sufficient to maintain personal boundaries, yet close enough for his lungs to greedily inhale the herbal fragrance that possessed the power to soothe his agonizing pain. Layla slowly ceased her cleaning as she felt the sharp gaze pinned upon her. She lifted her pale face, instantly meeting the sight of a great king struggling to grip the edge of the oak table to prevent himself from collapsing. Cold sweat continuously trickled down his proud brow, while his breath remained labored and fragmented. In that moment of absolute stillness, the sensitivity of one who had suffered greatly helped Layla recognize a cruel and bitter truth. The man who held supreme power over an entire vast empire was, in reality, hopelessly imprisoned within a cage of madness and dirty political intrigue. The suspicion and profound loneliness etched into his golden eyes were identical to the helplessness she endured after being stripped of her voice by the Rush Oath. Inside the Alpha King's mind, a fierce battle between primal instinct and rational thought was ceaselessly raging. The intense possessiveness of an alpha wolf screamed, urging him to lunge, to grab the small girl, and bury his face in the soft crook of her neck to drown in her healing scent and escape the piercing pain. However, the deep wounds of a man manipulated and betrayed by those closest to him held his feet fast. He absolutely refused to become a brutal monster, exploiting the lives of others just as his stepmother, Cassandra, had done and continued to do. A rough friction echoed in the dim space as the expensive royal velvet of Orion's cloak brushed against Layla's coarse, cheap fabric. The stark class divide seemed to vanish before the alignment of two souls, both bearing bleeding, unspoken wounds. Orion took a deep, steadying breath to calm his chaotic heart. He leaned slightly forward, maintaining a proud posture that nonetheless radiated an irrepressible, profound exhaustion. His eyes, the color of molten gold, stared straight into the mute girl's steady, ash-brown gaze with absolute seriousness. The voice of the most powerful man in the kingdom rang out, deeply hoarse, carrying the weight of suppressed agony, yet devoid of any cruel menace. I have no need for you to cringe in servitude or perform any menial tasks in this room. Orion paused for a brief beat to soothe the sharp throb flashing through his brain before continuing with words that would seal both their fates. I only need your absolute silence to reside here, so that your scent may keep my mind from falling into the abyss of madness. I will use my power to keep your life safe from the treacherous schemes of the court. The space around them sank into a prolonged silence, heavy as 1,000 stone blocks. Layla remained kneeling on the cold floor. Her eyes did not flinch, instead bravely looking deep into the fortified defensive wall surrounding the young king's heart. The man standing before her seemed to want to use cold, sharp words to mask his own weakness and his desperate need for healing. But do not ever mistake my protection for any sort of soft, romantic affection. Orion's eyes suddenly darkened, carrying the heightened vigilance of a wild beast that had suffered many fatal wounds in the past. I am simply trying to hold on to my own wretched life. Chapter 4. The sound of a storm lashing down, pounding against the massive crystal window panes of the bedchamber, signaled a brutal night ahead. Peals of thunder continuously tore through the pitch-black night sky, creating a furious symphony of wild nature that enveloped the entire fortress. Inside the vast expanse of the room, Layla's wild scent, bearing the breath of damp earth and wild daisies, was constantly fighting to purify the atmosphere. However, Queen Cassandra had secretly and cruelly increased the dosage of dark magic within the censers earlier that evening. The toxic incense, now seeping deep into Orion's rush stream, began to erupt violently, transforming into a terrifying hallucination. The muscular chest of the Alpha King heaved with ragged, fragmented breaths. His heavy gasps sounded full of agony amidst the flashes of blinding light brought by the lightning. In this waking nightmare, Orion saw his proud kingdom drowning in a sea of fire and rush. The alpha wolf within him howled incessantly, demanding to tear through skin and flesh to escape and seek release. He thrashed on the oversized royal bed, surrendering to the loss of control seizing his mind. His own sharp claws frantically raked against his bare, muscular chest. Fresh, crimson rush began to ooze from the wounds he had heartlessly inflicted upon himself, quickly soaking the pristine white silk bedsheets. From a dark, quiet corner beside the dying fireplace, Layla silently witnessed the utter collapse of the man who always appeared arrogant before others. The instinctive fear of one with low status facing a beast losing control instantly gripped her lungs. However, when Layla saw the streams of crimson rush flowing from the man's chest, the deep compassion hidden within her completely overcame all apprehension and terror. Though this man held the title of a king ruling an entire kingdom, in reality, he was but a pitiful victim struggling within the rush-stained cage of the royal rush line. The small girl slowly stepped with bare feet out of her safe, dark corner toward the large bed. The biting cold of the marble floor transmitting through the soles of her feet was a stark contrast to the searing, lethal heat radiating from the body of the man writhing in agony. Ignoring the alpha pressure frantically sweeping across the room, Layla courageously reached her thin hands, covered in countless calluses from labor, toward him. She slowly wrapped her arms around the king's firm waist, gently pressing her pale cheek against his vast, sweat-drenched back. At the very moment those two bodies, bearing so many psychological wounds, touched, all the violent madness in the room seemed to be completely frozen by an invisible, powerful force. The gentle warmth from the mute girl's body, along with the raw herbal scent, transferred directly into each of Orion's rigid vertebrae. Time within the bedchamber seemed to stand still. The alpha's chaotic, furious heartbeat slowly found a safe harbor, beginning to adjust itself to beat in a peaceful, steady rhythm with the resilient heart of the small girl. Orion gradually ceased all attempts at painful struggle as he felt the warm, silent presence embracing him from behind. He slowly turned to face her with eyes of molten gold still lingering with the undefined chaos of his recent hallucination. A heavy silence enveloped the two people submerged in the suffocation of the power cage. When the king's sharp gaze slowly dropped to Layla's porcelain-white neck, the rugged, cruel scars left by the rush oath instantly struck his vision. The Alpha King's heart felt as if it were being squeezed by an invisible hand when he realized a cruel and heartbreaking truth. For the first time, he clearly understood that this resilient little girl was mute because someone had violently stripped her of her voice using magic, not because of some lowly, innate defect as the malicious rumors claimed. The proud wolf within him roared with rage from the depths of his soul, craving to lunge out and tear to pieces anyone who had dared inflict such physical pain upon the woman standing before him. Orion slowly moved his large hands, still stained with fresh rush, to touch her thin shoulders, gently pulling her small frame closer until their foreheads rested against each other in a gesture of profound respect. The searing, rugged breath of the most powerful man in the kingdom entwined with the fragile breath of the potato-carrying maid amidst the silent, stormy night. If I am truly a mad monster always bringing destruction. Orion's voice sounded deep, hoarse, and filled with a painful tremor he could not hide. Why do you tremble with pity when you touch me instead of running away? Tell me with your eyes, what cruel creature was heartless enough to lock away your voice? Chapter 5. The massive oak doors of the bedchamber were suddenly shoved open with brutal force, ruthlessly tearing through the rare tranquility established after a night of terrifying storms. The precious silence inside the room was instantly shattered by hurried footsteps laden with extreme rage. Accompanying this arrogant intrusion was a pungent, luxurious synthetic perfume, representative of the gaudy nobility's banquets. That stifling scent quickly permeated the space, aggressively slamming into the soothing herbal vitality, carrying the breath of damp earth and wild daisies that had been shielding the Alpha King. Princess Serena, haughty and proud, strode into the chambers with the emerald-encrusted spring seal clutched in her hand, the symbol of a marriage heavy with political calculation. She carried the posture of a future queen ready to take over the realm, prepared to unleash a torrent of reproach upon her fiancé for abandoning her in the Great Hall. Yet, all of Serena's pride and fury instantly froze when her gaze collided with the scene unfolding upon the expansive royal bed. The man who held supreme power over the entire Southern Empire was submerged in a deep, peaceful sleep. The most shocking detail was that this arrogant king was burying his weary face deep into the crook of the slender neck of a potato-carrying maid, one of the lowest-born status. Orion's muscular arm was still unconsciously tightening around Layla's small waist, as if she were the only life buoy preventing him from drowning into the abyss of madness. A crazed, burning jealousy and unbearable humiliation instantly incinerated the beautiful princess's reason. Serena could not accept that the man she was about to wed would humble himself to seek solace from someone of the lowest possible origin. A dirty, deaf-mute thing like you dares to climb into the king's bed? Serena's voice rang out, jarringly shrill, dripping with the contemptuous venom of one who always deemed herself to be at the pinnacle of prestige. You are the lowest piece of trash in this castle. Get out of my sight immediately before I order your head to be severed. The cruel insults rained down upon Layla's eardrums, yet they were entirely unable to shake the steadfast stillness within her soul. Layla slowly shifted her gaze from Orion's sleeping face to Serena's face, which was twisted in rage. The mute girl showed no sign of panic, nor did she retreat into the shadows to seek safety, as one of low status would typically do when facing such power. Instead, Layla very carefully and gently supported the broad shoulders of the man leaning against her, slowly lowering him onto the soft silk pillow so as not to wake the exhausted wolf. Once certain the king was settled, Layla slowly stood upright. Her cold, bare feet stepped confidently onto the marble floor, moving resolutely to a position that blocked the path between the royal bed and the princess, who was brimming with murderous intent. The small, thin figure of Layla in her coarse, cheap clothing now carried an undeniable, immense spiritual strength. She used her own life, deemed worthless by society, to form a firm wall, determined to protect the most powerful man in the kingdom precisely at the moment he was at his most vulnerable. Layla's ash-brown eyes looked straight into Serena's arrogant gaze, conveying a silent, razor-sharp message. This boundary must absolutely not be crossed. It was this silent yet fierce confrontation that triggered the mate-protective instinct from deep within the Alpha King's soul. The absence of the familiar warmth and the sedative herbal scent instantly awakened the slumbering alpha wolf. Orion snapped his eyes open, revealing a brilliant, golden hue. Thousands of sharp, dangerous glimmers swiftly dispelled his earlier exhaustion. Upon realizing that an outsider was harboring murderous intent toward the safety of the little girl within his territory, the alpha's aura erupted like a violent hurricane. The temperature inside the chamber plummeted dreadfully, causing the very air to be drained from the lungs of all present. Orion immediately rose from the large bed, taking steady, purposeful steps forward. A low, menacing growl rumbled deep within the man's muscular chest. He did not hesitate to use his broad back to completely shield Layla's small frame from Serena's malicious gaze, becoming the most impenetrable shield for one person alone. The terrifying pressure of the alpha's aura caused Serena's knees to weaken, forcing the proud princess to instinctively stumble backward in sheer terror. For the first time in her life, lived within fake velvet and silk, Serena was shocked to realize a cruel truth unfolding before her eyes. The man who bore the title of her fiancé had never, and perhaps would never, look at her with the absolute protection and intense possessiveness he held for this girl. The pride built upon Serena's lies began to fracture into tiny pieces, leaving her vaguely questioning the true purpose of this politically stained marriage. Orion stood tall like an immovable mountain of stone, his gaze, sharp as a rush-stained blade, pinned straight upon the trembling princess opposite him. His firm arms slowly lifted, his long fingers pointing directly toward the wide-open grand doors. The king's voice rang out, cold and laden with absolute authority that permitted no one the right to resist or negotiate. Serena, You may receive that resplendent crown next month thanks to that woman's foolish machinations." Orion lowered his voice, but the weight of every word uttered was sufficient to crush the self-esteem of any who dared to challenge his power. "But this quiet room, and the girl standing behind me, are the absolute boundary that you are never permitted to cross." Chapter 6. The panic-stricken footsteps, heavy with utter humiliation, echoed along the dark and deserted corridors of the royal fortress. Princess Serena had just fled from the Alpha King's bedchamber with a heart bleeding from her trampled pride. The image of the man she was betrothed to, the cold, stoic ruler, using his broad back to shield a lowborn, mute servant girl, played repeatedly in her mind. A frantic, jealous rage mingled with an irrepressible resentment, causing her chest to heave rhythmically, her fingers still clutching the emerald-encrusted spring seal. She had intended to rush straight into the warm embrace of Queen Cassandra to weep and demand justice from her adoptive mother's authority. Yet, as her hurried steps paused before the massive oak doors leading to the powerful queen's chambers, an uncanny atmosphere instantly halted her every action. The haughty princess's senses were immediately besieged by a pungent, musty odor, vastly different from the luxurious perfume she was accustomed to. This foul stench mingled with the acrid, earthy scent of dark herbs, constantly snaking out from the narrow gap beneath the closed door. The sharpness of one born into a world teeming with political intrigue allowed Serena to instantly perceive an invisible danger lurking in the darkness. Whispers in a ghostly, arcane language echoed with eerie, drawn-out tones from behind the cold stone wall. Serena's white silk-gloved hands trembled violently. She hastily slipped through a partially closed side door to sneak into the vast chamber. The stifling atmosphere, thick with dark magic, made her lungs ache, but curiosity and instinctive fear forced her to seek a safe hiding place. The gorgeous princess hurriedly dug her fingers into the thick, cold velvet of a giant curtain to conceal her risky presence. Through a tiny gap between the dark velvet folds, the flickering light of a magical candle illuminated the heavily painted, monstrously evil face of the woman she had always respectfully called mother. A warlock in a black cloak stood facing her, holding a thick, dark red liquid that endlessly emitted gray, swirling smoke. These two, representing the cruelty of a rotten power system, were conspiring over a horrific plan that could bury the entire future of the Southern Empire. "You truly think I care for the life or death of a girl born from the lowly peasant class?" Cassandra's thin, sharp voice rang out, laden with supreme contempt for the person absent. Every word uttered from that cruel mouth felt like a poisoned blade piercing the eardrums of the person hiding behind the velvet curtain. Once the sparkling spring seal completes its magical activation and drains the entire ruling strength of that mad prince on our bonding night, the worthless puppet named Serena will automatically become the sacrificial lamb, dying in place of my own flesh and rush. Queen Cassandra wore a triumphant, cruel smile as she mentioned the tragic fate of her foster daughter. Serena's entire proud worldview instantly shattered into thousands of sharp shards, cutting deep into her fragile psyche. This horrific truth was like a freezing bucket of water from the northern glaciers splashed directly onto the soul of one who had always imagined herself at the pinnacle of supreme power. Serena finally realized with horror why that royal mother had never offered her a truly warm embrace. The extravagant ball gowns embroidered with pure gold thread, the grand dance parties overflowing with fine wine, or the arranged marriage to the most powerful man in the kingdom, all these glamorous things were not favors bestowed upon a royal daughter, but merely superficial decorations wrapping a sacrificial offering. The dark warlock cautiously voiced a warning about a variable that could ruin the entire sinister plan they had painstakingly arranged over 10 long years. But if the pure royal rush of the northern princess awakens and breaks the seal, all our sacrificial magic will suffer a violent backlash. The minion's deep voice carried an undeniable anxiety when mentioning the nemesis of the darkness. Cassandra curled her lip in a cold smile, her eyes flashing with the cunning of a venomous snake that already held victory in its grasp. That nightmare shall never have the chance to happen, because the true princess who carries that great pure rush is currently forced to live like a stray dog under the identity of a mute, deaf potato maid. She spat the triumphant words from deep within her throat, savoring the cruel results of her own design. Her vocal cords were locked tight by an irreversible rush oath 10 years ago. If she dares to let out the faintest sound of a plea, the wretched life of her foster brother, currently rotting in the water dungeon, will be immediately and cruelly snuffed out. A bitter, choking sensation surged into her throat, forcing Serena to use both silk-gloved hands to clamp her mouth shut, preventing the sobs about to erupt. The extreme psychological shock created a violent upheaval, demolishing all of her previous arrogant perceptions. She realized with horror that she and the low-born mute girl, whom the guards had humiliated in the hall earlier, actually shared the same tragic fate. The intense confrontation and petty jealousy she had always harbored toward Layla suddenly became more ridiculous and meaningless than ever. Both of them, from beginning to end, were merely pitiful victims stripped of their identities, used as tools for bottomless greed, and ruthlessly stifled inside a gilded cage of deceit designed by this ambitious woman. The extreme cold from the metal spring seal in her hand transmitted directly into the veins beneath her skin, constantly reminding her of a painful death awaiting her just ahead. If she continued to obediently accept the fate of a spineless princess, her life and the proud Alpha King's would both be buried in the abyss of dark magic. The false pride molded from luxury vanished from Serena's mind, leaving room for a powerful awakening that would dictate the course of her own destiny. Serena slowly raised her trembling hands to wipe away the weak tears rolling down her pale, hollow cheeks. Her eyes, which had once held only vanity, suddenly turned razor-sharp, fiery, and more resolute than ever before. She would absolutely not allow herself to die in humiliating silence like a toy that had outlived its usefulness. A craving for freedom burned fiercely, incinerating all the cowardly fear that tried to chain her feet to the darkness. The small but resolute hand of the princess tightened its grip on the dark sacrificial object, which was vibrating with evil magic. She stared fixedly at her own reflection in the dim bronze mirror, slowly making a decision that would alter the entire destiny of the kingdom. I will absolutely not be a doll that dies in your stead. Chapter 7. The silent atmosphere inside the Alpha King's chamber was suddenly torn asunder by a surge of dark magic carrying a lethal scent. The tranquility that had enveloped the vast room was crushed in a mere heartbeat, as if an invisible hand from the shadows had reached out to choke every sound, every breath, and every remaining ray of light. The thick, suffocating smoke of the incense, carrying the gray ash of death, continuously spilled through the narrow gap beneath the massive oak doors. At first, it was but a thin mist crawling along the floor, but it quickly coiled into heavy, cold, and terrifying layers of toxic clouds. The incense, which should have brought serenity, was now twisted by dark magic into a nauseatingly sweet aroma, like the scent of decaying flowers in a coffin, making anyone who inhaled even a single breath feel as if their soul were being dragged into an bottomless abyss. The velvet drapes embroidered with gold thread shivered despite the absence of wind. The candlelight on the silver stands flickered, as if about to die, and the magical patterns inlaid on the walls were covered in a gloomy, dark hue, transforming the opulent bedchamber into a suffocating, frozen prison. Queen Cassandra had decided to strike first to completely extinguish the life of the stepson who stood in her way to absolute power. To achieve this, she not only used the most ruthless poison but also unleashed the most powerful dark magic she had secretly cultivated for years. Every exit was sealed in silence, from the main door and windows to the smallest cracks in the stone walls, to ensure that no one outside could detect the incident, and no one inside could escape the process of toxic dissemination unfolding slowly and desperately. A cold metal object was thrown hard through the narrow gap, skittering across the marble floor. Its sharp, grating friction sounded jarring amidst the smoke-choked room, causing Layla's heart to seize with a dark premonition. She looked down, and in the moment she recognized the twisted, rush-stained iron bracelet, her face turned deathly pale. It was the bracelet Liam always wore, an old keepsake he had once deemed a silent promise that no matter how cruel the world was, or where fate cast them, he would find his way back to protect her. But now, it lay abandoned before her, deformed, icy, and stained with the marks of violence, a cruel death sentence that Cassandra had intentionally placed in her path. Immediately following was the thin, venomous voice of the ambitious woman, sounding clearly from outside the door, each word sharpened with malice. Your foster brother Liam is currently bound tight in the dark water dungeon beneath the earth with unbreakable magic chains. Her threat was like a poisoned blade, piercing the little girl's most fatal weakness, causing Layla's breath to choke in her throat. Cassandra seemed satisfied by that stunned silence, so she continued, her voice slower and more wicked. The tide is rising violently and will soon swallow his fragile body whole. If you dare to utter the name of the prince waiting for death in there to break the spell, your brother will instantly perish from the Rush Oath's brutal punishment. Each word was calculated to push Layla into the abyss of despair, for Cassandra knew well that while Layla might endure any physical pain, she could never calmly watch her only kin be sacrificed. Terrifying desperation instantly enveloped the mind of the lowly potato maid. Layla frantically looked at the large royal bed, where the man holding supreme power over the empire lay in a deep coma, his usual arrogant appearance eroded by the intense toxin to the point of being unrecognizable. The Alpha King's face was deathly pale beneath the gray smoke. His lips, which usually held such authority, had lost all color, and his massive chest heaved with only weak, fragmented breaths, as if each gasp were stolen from the hands of death. The massive toxicity of the incense smoke in the air had completely overwhelmed her fragile herbal vitality, rendering the faint healing power within Layla's body as insignificant as a weak spark surrounded by a blizzard of darkness. She could clearly feel his life being drained away, bit by bit, not loudly, not violently, but slowly, persistently, and cruelly enough to drive one insane. The proud life of the only man who had ever respected her personal boundaries, the only one who had looked directly at her without seeing her as a lowly tool, was fading hopelessly with every passing moment. Layla clenched her trembling hands, her mind flashing between the image of Liam bound beneath the cold water and the pale face of the Alpha King before her. On one side was the brother who had sheltered her through years of hunger. On the other was the man who had shown her she had the right to be respected. Wicked Cassandra had intentionally turned both lives into two blades pressed against her heart. Refusing to surrender to her wretched fate, Layla frantically grabbed a heavy, solid bronze candelabra by the fireplace. The object was ice-cold and so heavy her thin arms could barely lift it, but in this moment of extremity, her survival instinct and the fear of losing her most important people sparked an unimaginable, desperate strength. She channeled the full power of a peasant laborer, accustomed to carrying, lifting, and enduring hardship, into her calloused hands, slamming the makeshift weapon repeatedly against the enchanted crystal windows. The jarring, desperate sounds of impact echoed throughout the room. Each noise was like a cry for help crushed against the invisible barrier, but the evil magical glass did not show even a tiny crack. Conversely, every time the candelabra struck the glass, the violent rebound sent searing pain through Layla's wrists, causing her palms to split and fresh rush to stain the cold metal. She screamed for help, but the sound, once released from her throat, was swallowed by the seal, turning into a choked echo only she could hear. As her stamina drained and her arms could no longer lift the heavy candelabra, the resilient girl staggered to the sturdy oak door, using her own 10 fingertips to frantically claw at the surface. The cold, rough wood quickly shredded her delicate skin. Rush seeped from her fingertips, leaving crimson streaks on the door. Yet Layla refused to stop, for she feared that if she let go for even a second, one of the two would vanish from this world forever. While Layla struggled in utter helplessness inside the closing cage of power, a decisive rebellion was silently unfolding in the cold, subterranean dungeon. Princess Serena had completely cast aside her useless, haughty veneer and cumbersome, glamorous gowns to rush straight to the damp cellar of the royal fortress, a place she had never set foot in before, believing it to be a filthy, dark realm beneath her status. But now, the cruel truth of her fake identity, Cassandra's manipulation, and the lies layered over the royal family like rotting gold had made Serena refuse to be an obedient doll any longer. She tore off the heavy train of her skirt to run faster, her fair hand gripping the emerald-encrusted spring seal so tightly her knuckles turned white. The foul, musty odor, the freezing humidity, and the terrifying gloom of the water dungeon could not dampen the resolute steps of a girl desperately seeking self-liberation. The burly royal guards were initially stunned by her sudden appearance, for in their eyes, Serena was merely a princess raised in silk and ritual, incapable of defying the queen's orders. But that very contempt became their fatal mistake. Serena used the sharpness of her wit, the element of surprise, and everything she had observed during her years amidst court intrigue to swiftly dismantle the defensive system, stabbing a hairpin into the wrist of the keykeeper, knocking over a barrel of water to make the stone floor slippery, and exploiting the guards' hesitation regarding her royal status to bypass them by a hair's breadth. The moment she saw the young man named Liam bound and gasping amidst the rising, filthy water, Serena felt all the fury in her heart ignite more violently than ever. Liam was pinned to the stone wall by black magical chains, his wrists bleeding from struggling too long, his hair plastered to his pale face, his breath so faint it was nearly drowned out by the sound of the water. The icy dungeon water rose steadily, slow and cruel as a beast licking its prey before devouring it. Serena waded in, the biting cold cut into her flesh like hundreds of sharp needles, but she did not retreat. She held the emerald-encrusted spring seal high, the cold green light from the gem reflecting in her eyes, which were reddened with rage. There was not a shred of hesitation or regret for the fake royal status molded from lies. To her now, the seal was no longer a symbol of power or glory, but merely a dark sacrificial object wrapped in a noble shell, a beautiful lock used to bind the innocent to Cassandra's schemes. Serena gathered all her strength and slammed the sacrificial object against the solid stone wall. The first strike created only a thin crack. The second caused the light inside the gem to churn violently, and on the final blow, as she nearly screamed with all her pent-up fury, the deceptive royal seal shattered in her hand. This drastic, system-dismantling act instantly shattered the entire water dungeon's barrier, simultaneously freeing the innocent from near death. A terrifying explosion of released magical power echoed from the dungeon's depths, creating an invisible shockwave that rippled along the ancient stone walls and slammed into the fortress's highest tower. The magical chains on Liam shivered and shattered into fragments of dying black light, while the water in the dungeon churned violently as if swept by an invisible storm. Serena lunged to catch Liam as his exhausted body slumped, uncaring that the filthy water soaked her torn dress and caused her whole body to tremble with cold. At the same time, inside the sealed chamber, Layla's resilience, now at its absolute limit, suddenly received a brilliant ray of hope. The stone floor beneath her feet shuddered. The thick incense smoke paused for a moment as if disrupted by some force, and the black veins on the oak door suddenly flickered weakly. Layla raised her head in a coughing fit, her eyes red from the toxic smoke and tears, when her keen hearing caught a familiar voice echoing from afar. Serena's loud shouting pierced through the thick wooden doors, through the long, cold corridors, and through the weakening seal, carrying a fierce sense of freedom and a triumphant declaration that resonated throughout the royal halls. The words of the fake princess were like a great key of light, instantly opening the cage that had held Layla's soul in darkness for 10 long years. Layla, I have personally shattered that deceptive royal seal to save your brother from the water dungeon. Serena's voice rang out with power and without a trace of inhibition, no longer the voice of a princess taught to be gentle, submissive, and mindful of appearances, but the voice of a human being who had finally dared to tear off her own chains. Hurry and free yourself, you fool. Speak now to save the only man who can see your true value. Layla stood stunned amidst the smoke-filled room, her ruchite hands hanging at her sides, her heart, which Cassandra had thought crushed, beating wildly again.
Liam was saved.
Cassandra's threat had lost its power. The cruel choice the woman had staged had collapsed. And in that moment, Layla finally understood that what had truly bound her for years was not just the rush oath or dark magic, but the fear that had been stuffed into her soul since she was too young. Outside the door, Cassandra suddenly went silent. That silence was more terrifying than her previous wicked laughter, for it proved that she, too, had heard Serena's declaration and realized her perfect plan now had an irreparable fracture. Chapter 8. The faint light of the magical candles finally flickered out, leaving the bedchamber plunged into a dense, cold darkness. The lingering incense smoke hung in the air like a thin veil of death, seeping into the crevices of the velvet drapes, clinging to the marble floor, and curling around the expansive royal bed. The opulent splendor of the room had completely lost its former majesty, leaving only a suffocating sensation, like a tomb built of gold, silver, and power. Layla collapsed beside the royal bed, her thin, trembling hands covering Orion's muscular chest, which was becoming increasingly still. Beneath her palms, the Alpha King's heartbeat had become incredibly weak, flickering in and out, as if he were drifting far from reality to sink deep into an eternal abyss. The dried rush from the wounds on his chest had now turned a deep, dark black, spreading into terrifying, ominous veins beneath his pale skin, a horrific sign that the incense toxin had reached his very marrow and was attempting to devour the last remaining sliver of life within him. The terror of losing the only man who had ever truly seen her soul beneath the mask of a mute maid shattered all of Layla's reason. In that moment, every sound around her seemed to vanish, leaving only Orion's shallow breaths and the sound of her own heart hammering painfully against her ribs. She realized that the silence she had meticulously guarded for 10 years, the weapon that had helped her survive the dungeon of life, was now the very noose tightening around the life of the person she loved. That same silence had once protected Liam from punishment, helped her survive under the Queen's watchful eyes, and allowed her to become an obedient shadow that no one suspected. But now, it was no longer a shelter. It had become a cold wall separating her from the final chance to pull Orion back. The rush oath, that invisible shackle the wicked Queen had used to seal her vocal cords, suddenly became insignificant compared to her desperate craving for her mate's salvation. Compared to the fear of losing him, every agony the curse could inflict became negligible. Layla slowly inhaled the last bit of air in the room. The breath carried the bitterness of toxic smoke, the metallic tang of rush, and the biting chill of approaching death. She channeled all her mental strength and the purest energy from the northern royal rush line flowing in her veins into the deepest part of her soul, a place she had intentionally buried for years in exchange for a fragile existence. She placed her palm over the location of her cursed larynx, feeling the distinct resistance of flesh locked tight by magic for a decade. Beneath her delicate skin, the rush oath seal coiled like a venomous snake awakened, instantly tightening around her throat to punish her attempt at rebellion. A horrific burning sensation, akin to swallowing thousands of burning embers, began to spread from deep within her throat, causing her entire body to convulse violently from the excruciating pain. Cold sweat broke out on her forehead, tears brimmed from her eyes, yet Layla bit her lip until it bled, refusing to let herself retreat. The invisible chains of the rush oath were being forced to stretch to their limit against the resistant power of a resilient soul that refused to submit. The physical pain reached a brutal level, making Layla feel as if her vocal cords were being torn into tiny shreds. Her throat burned. Every breath felt like dragging a sharp blade across tender flesh, but the more painful it became, the more intense her will to save Orion grew. The pure royal rush line, a power so carefully hidden beneath the appearance of a lowly potato maid, suddenly awakened with terrifying intensity. It was not loud at first, appearing only as a tiny silver spark flashing in the darkness, then rapidly spreading throughout her body like a glacial river melting beneath the sun. The pressurized air from the depths of her lungs screamed to be released, relentlessly piercing the cracking magical seal. Every fiber inside her throat seemed burned by the silver light of truth, striking down all the dark conspiracies that had imprisoned her in darkness for 10 long, drawn-out years. Invisible cracks spread along Layla's neck, emitting a faint light like silver threads, signaling that the cruel lock Cassandra had placed upon her was reaching its final breaking point. At the very moment darkness engulfed the Alpha King's breath, when Orion's chest barely stirred and the warmth beneath Layla's hands was fading, she poured her entire life force into the single call she reserved for this man. All her pain, fear, loneliness, the years of being forced to bow, and the love that could not be spoken, all converged in that moment. A sound, clear, pure, and possessing the power to shake the towering stone tower, suddenly erupted, tearing through the deathly silent space. It was not the scream of the oppressed, nor the pleading cry of a weak maid, but the heroic roar of a queen breaking her chains to return to her own throne. Orion. The name burst from Layla's lips with a power so intense that the very air in the room vibrated. Shards of broken glass on the floor rattled, and the thick, black incense smoke was forced away, like darkness fearing the dawn. As soon as that name was uttered from her liberated vocal cords, a surge of primal silver light erupted from Layla's chest, carrying the might of 1,000 bolts of pure lightning. The light was not violently blinding, but both radiant and noble, like northern moonlight pouring onto white snow, cold, yet absolutely untainted. The dark barriers enshrouding the Alpha King's chamber were instantly blown away by that light, shattering into millions of tiny crystals without leaving a trace. The black cursing characters clinging to the walls hissed like living creatures before melting away, while the smoke containing the lethal toxin was swept out of the room, dissipating into weak, thin wisps before vanishing into nothingness. The sturdy oak door was struck by the invisible power and knocked off its hinges, creating a booming sound that echoed through the halls and opening a vast space for the first dawn light to filter into the room. Those pale rays fell upon Orion's deathly pale face, upon Layla's tangled hair, and upon her ruchied hands, as if the new day itself were witnessing the moment the curse was broken. Orion, the man hovering on the brink of death, shivered slightly before his great, golden-hued eyes suddenly snapped open amidst the chaos of the magical residue. His first breath upon waking was heavy, like a wounded beast finally escaping the trap that had held him in darkness. The gold in his eyes was initially clouded by toxicity, but within a few breaths, it became sharp and radiant, carrying the familiar authority of the Supreme King just pulled back from the borders of death. He saw Layla kneeling there, her lips trembling slightly after having permanently erased her fake silence, her small, pale face haggard from pain, but her eyes glowing with a brilliance that held his gaze. Her eyes were now filled with a pure, silver authority that no one had ever been permitted to behold, no longer the resignation of a lowly maid, nor the fear of the oppressed, but the steadfastness of one who had finally remembered who she was. Layla, her hands still raw from excruciating pain, slowly looked deep into the awakened soul of the man she had staked her entire life to awaken. Her voice, though still slightly hoarse from the echoes of the curse, now resonated with the tone of absolute freedom. Orion, wake up. Never again leave me alone inside this dark cage. Chapter 9. The sound of the crystal windows shattered by Layla's pure silver power still echoed coldly throughout the chamber, but liberation did not come peacefully. The very moment the dark barrier was blown away by Layla, a crazed laugh from Queen Cassandra erupted from behind the dissipating plumes of black smoke. She had been waiting for this moment, waiting for the vulnerability of Layla when she poured her entire life force into saving her Alpha King. She was not dead. Rather, she had set the most cruel, final trap at the very center of life itself. You think you can save him? Cassandra's hiss pierced through the space, carrying the triumph of one holding the scythe of death. I cast the rush oath of transference into your very bond of mates. If you break your vocal seal, all the incense toxins and dark magic accumulating within the Alpha King will not vanish. They will flow backward into the veins of the one who called his name. Orion, having just opened his eyes in clarity, realized with horror that his body had suddenly become strangely weightless. But the next second, A stifled cry of agony escaped Layla. The small girl collapsed, her hands clutching the front of his tunic. A plume of black smoke, cold and thick as tar, began to snake from the crook of Orion's neck, slithering across his burning flesh to dive straight into Layla's body. Layla felt destruction approaching. The toxins permeated her rush, incinerating every cell with a horrific temperature, while the dark magic silenced her heartbeat. She knew that if she pushed Orion away now, he would be completely safe, but he would lose their connection and be unable to ever return. Instead of letting go, Layla hugged his muscular back tightly, actively using her own body to guide the darkness out of him.
Layla, no.
Push me away. You will die. Orion roared, the despair in his voice tearing through the night. He frantically attempted to sever the connection between them, his trembling fingers clawing at the fateful pendant on her neck, but Cassandra's magic had locked them tight. He felt the warmth in Layla's body being slowly drained, replaced by the bone-deep cold of a lethal curse. The Alpha King's golden eyes, once filled with authority, now held only helplessness and excruciating pain as he realized he could do nothing but witness the one he loved wither away because of him. The chill of the toxin began to spread to Layla's face, turning her skin pale and translucent like a statue of ice. She kept her gaze fixed on Orion, her breath as fragile as a silk thread, yet a strange, reassuring smile bloomed on her lips. She knew she could hold on, because the latent healing power of the Northern Royal Rush Line was surging to confront the darkness, even if the price to pay was the exhaustion of her entire life force. Orion could no longer maintain the composure of a monarch. He fell to his knees on the ruined floor, cradling Layla's cooling body to his chest. The first hot tears of his life fell upon her forehead. I do not need the throne if it is traded for your life. I do not need the kingdom if it must be stained with your rush. He roared frantically, his remorse and fear driving him to complete madness. He began to use his own claws to slash deep into his palms, attempting to use the rush of an Alpha King to dissolve the curse, heedless of the dark magic's backlash that caused his own flesh to split open. The scene left the entire tower in absolute silence. Just then, a horn from the north resounded, shattering the mournful atmosphere. Layla's parents entered, and the sight of the daughter they had lost for 10 years, now dying in the arms of the man who had imprisoned her, plunged the hall into a terrifying, deep-seated resentment. Layla felt the warmth of her parents. She tried to reach out a hand to touch Orion's tear-drenched face. Her voice was hoarse and whispered, yet held a final, resolute steadiness before her eyes slowly closed in his embrace. Don't cry. Keep your kingdom, for it deserves the justice we have reclaimed. She faded into his chest, leaving Orion in an abyss of emptiness and a blaze of hatred burning in the eyes of the Northern Wolf Pack that had just arrived.
Chapter 10.
The royal hall, once the seat of supreme authority, was now nothing more than a desolate ruin. Shards of shattered crystal lay scattered across the marble floor, reflecting the pale light of dawn as it filtered into the room through the collapsed ceiling. Cassandra, the woman who once confidently held the power of life and death, was now writhing in agony on the cold stone, suffering from the horrific backlash of the dark magic that had been shattered. Her black, jewel-encrusted scepter, the symbol of her malevolent power, had been snapped into jagged, blackened pieces strewn about. She struggled to crawl upward, her fingers clawing into the stone crevices, her breath hissing like a cornered viper as she witnessed the brutal, patriarchal dynasty she had painstakingly built crumbling before her very eyes. At that exact moment, a deep, resonant, and authoritative sound echoed from the main gate, rapidly spreading into the depths of the hall. It was the horn crafted from the horn of a northern white wolf, a heroic sound signaling the return of the true masters of the frozen lands. The massive oak fortress gates were thrust open with tremendous force, revealing hundreds of white wolf warriors with eyes burning under the dawnlight, encircling the castle. The king and queen of the Northern Kingdom, Layla's biological parents, walked slowly into the hall with solemn and commanding gazes. They required no display of petty power, for the mere aura radiating from their presence was enough to force all the courtiers who had once scorned Layla to prostrate themselves upon the stone floor. They dismantled Cassandra's entire cruel plot of usurpation and the child-swapping of years past before the eyes of the entire court. Evidence of the Rush Oath and secret letters trading with dark powers were presented in exhaustive detail, all exposed to the light, leaving the cunning nobility silent in sheer terror. Orion was no longer the arrogant Alpha King with his usual aloof exterior. He stepped out amidst the ruins, using his royal might in coordination with Layla's parents to strip the rebels of all military authority. The hands that had only ever known the sword and slaughter now gently grasped the calloused, labor-scarred hands of the maid who once delivered potatoes. He did not hesitate to kneel on one knee before her amidst the shock of the entire court, publicly renouncing the pride of a supreme alpha to honor the woman who had redeemed his soul. "I would rather be cursed by this entire kingdom than live a single day without you." Orion's voice was low, each word spoken as if draining the last remaining strength of a king who had just tasted the depths of loss. He used the very drops of rush oozing from his palms to touch the nape of Layla's neck, attempting to dissolve the final remnants of the lethal curse. Layla stood in the center of the vast hall, feeling a powerful tremor in her soul as she looked into the understanding eyes of her biological parents. The memories of 10 years as a servant, the long nights of humiliation, and the bitter silence now suddenly felt unimaginably distant. She looked down at her own hands that had once been accustomed to handling potatoes and wiping away ash, now surrounded by the admiring gazes of those who had once looked down upon her. Her identity crisis was gradually replaced by a pure sense of pride as her biological mother, the northern queen with hair like snow, walked slowly toward her and pulled her into a tight embrace. Heavy iron chains rattled as the royal guard dragged Cassandra toward the eternal dungeons, ending an era of cruelty, scorn, and hatred. Amidst the chaos and noise of the hall, Layla suddenly felt an extraordinary peace as she realized she no longer needed to hide behind a lowly mask. The Northern Queen tightened her hold, whispering softly into her daughter's ear while tears of happiness fell upon Layla's pale forehead. "My little girl, you were never a lowly, mute wretch as those wicked rumors claimed. This cage was never worthy of my daughter's soul." She lifted Layla's delicate face, looking straight into the resolute ash-brown eyes that had always shone despite the countless storms they had endured. Amidst the silence of the court, Layla's eyes trembled. Then, under the dawn light shining through the collapsed ceiling, those eyes slowly opened. There was no more weakness, no more fear. There remained only the awakening of a true queen who had traversed the fire of darkness. Chapter 11. The radiant morning sunlight stretched across the marble slabs of the royal hall, transforming the space that was once a cold prison into a sanctuary for the light of rebirth. The ceremony recognizing Layla's royal status was held under the witness of the entire court, including those who had once scorned her when she was but a servant. The resounding cheers of the crowd outside the fortress walls were like powerful waves crashing against the shore, creating a majestic symphony to welcome the true princess returning from the darkness. On a dais draped in deep crimson velvet, the supreme Luna crown shimmered under the sun, symbolizing the ultimate power that any woman in the kingdom would crave to possess. Orion, the Alpha King with eyes of golden hue no longer troubled by chaos, walked slowly toward Layla. He abandoned his usual arrogance, kneeling without hesitation before the woman who had redeemed his soul, offering the noble crown upon her hands. In that moment, silence blanketed the entire hall, awaiting the decision of the girl who carried the pure rush of the north. Layla looked at the brilliant crown, then down at the faint scars on her wrists, the traces of 10 years imprisoned in silence. She slowly reached out with her calloused hands, gently lifting Orion to his feet. Layla looked straight into the eyes of the man who had walked with her across the line between life and death, then slowly placed the crown back onto the velvet cushion. That act caused the entire court to hold its breath. "This crown belongs to those who wish to rule," Layla spoke, her clear voice echoing throughout the hall. "As for me, I only wish to belong to the one who knows how to love." She descended the steps of the dais, her eyes as tranquil as an autumn lake, sweeping across the faces that had once been filled with contempt. She did not need a throne to be recognized, for she had already validated herself. She chose to walk out from the rigid stone walls with Orion, returning to the wild nature where wild daisies still bloomed after the rain. Serena also appeared at the grand entrance of the hall, no longer bearing a fake, haughty air, but instead the radiance of a woman who had just found herself. She wore simple but elegant attire, stepping forward to give Layla a sincere farewell hug. It was an embrace between two women who had been imprisoned, and who had now broken their own chains with their own hands. Total liberation was felt in every one of Layla's breaths as she and Orion stepped through the fortress gate, leaving the gilded royal cage behind them. To them, the throne was no longer a symbol of power, but a prison with no exit. They belonged to the old, shadowed forests, to the freedom of the wolf packs running across the northern white snow, and to a peace unbound by prejudices of rushline. The forest winds rustled through the canopy, carrying the scent of damp earth and the beginning of an eternal journey. Orion gripped Layla's calloused hand tightly, his eyes filled with adoration as he looked toward the dawn breaking on the distant horizon. He knew that from now on, their lives would be written with understanding and compassion. He tilted his head slightly to look at her, his voice low and warm, meant only for the woman he considered the only crown of his life. Where your freedom lies, that is my kingdom. Their freedom began the very moment they stepped through the gate, leaving behind the darkness of an old dynasty and heading toward the light of a life that belonged only to the two of them.